The moment those blue and red lights flash in your rearview mirror, everything changes. Your grip tightens on the steering wheel, your heart rate jumps. You check your speed, your mirrors, your surroundings, like somehow the answer is going to appear in those few seconds before you pull over. And then that thought creeps in, the one that a lot of drivers have. I know my rights. I've seen the videos. I know exactly what to say. But do you? Have you ever been pulled over and felt like the officer was testing you, pushing you, or trying to get you to say something you didn't want to say? If you have, I want you to share that experience in the comments, because what you think happened and what was actually happening might not be the same thing. And as we go through this, you're going to start noticing patterns that most drivers miss entirely. Because this story, she thought she knew her rights and it turned into a felony chase, is not about someone being reckless from the start. It's about how small misunderstandings, timing, tone, and assumptions can escalate a situation way faster than people expect. Let's walk through it the way it actually happens in real life. You're driving home. Maybe it's late. Maybe you're just tired. You glance in your mirror, and there they are. Lights on, no siren yet, but clearly signaling you to pull over. You hesitate for a second, maybe wondering if it's really for you. That hesitation alone is already something the officer is noticing. From the officer's perspective, that moment matters. They're asking themselves, why didn't she pull over immediately? Is she distracted? Nervous? Trying to hide something? Even if the answer is completely innocent, the observation gets logged mentally. Now you pull over, engine running, hands maybe on the wheel, maybe not. The officer approaches, and before they even speak, they're already reading you. Your posture, your eye movement, how quickly you look at them, whether you're fumbling with something. Do you know why I pulled you over? That question right there is where things start to go sideways for a lot of people. You've probably heard that you should never answer that question. You've probably heard that it's a trap. And yes, sometimes it can be. But here's the part people don't talk about enough. How you refuse matters just as much as the refusal itself. In this case, she didn't just decline to answer. She responded with an edge in her voice. Something like, "I'm not answering questions." Now, legally, that might feel correct. But practically, it changes the entire tone of the interaction. The officer now shifts from routine stop mode to something more alert. Not necessarily hostile, but more investigative. Why? Because in their experience, people who immediately go rigid and defensive sometimes have something else going on. That doesn't mean they're right. It means that's how they interpret behavior. So the officer tries again, slightly different wording. "Where are you coming from tonight?" Silence. Or maybe the same repeated phrase, "I'm not answering questions." Now here's where tension builds in a way that most drivers don't realize is happening. Officers are trained to observe consistency, not just in your answers, but in your behavior. If your behavior doesn't match what they expect for a routine traffic stop, they start looking deeper. And this is where the myth of just say nothing and you're safe starts to crack a little. Because silence alone doesn't escalate things, but how that silence is delivered can. The officer goes back to basics: license, registration, and proof of insurance. She hands them over, but not smoothly. Maybe she takes a little too long. Maybe she makes a comment under her breath. Maybe she records the interaction openly, which is her right. But again, it adds another layer to how the officer is interpreting the situation. Now, something subtle happens. The officer holds on to the documents longer than expected. A lot of drivers get anxious at this point. They think, why is he still holding my license? He's not allowed to do that for no reason. But here's the reality. During a stop, officers are allowed to retain your documents while they're conducting the purpose of the stop. And what counts as reasonable duration depends on context. So when she demands them back early, am I being detained or am I free to go? She's technically asking a valid question, but the timing is off. Timing is everything during a traffic stop. If the officer hasn't completed the initial reason for the stop, that question doesn't end the encounter. It often just irritates the officer or signals that the driver is trying to control the situation. And now the tone shifts again. Step out of the vehicle. That command catches a lot of people off guard. They think they can refuse. They've seen videos saying you don't have to exit your vehicle. That's not accurate in most situations. Officers generally have the authority to order drivers out of the vehicle during a lawful stop. It's been upheld repeatedly in court decisions because of officer safety concerns. So when she refuses, "I'm not getting out of the car," that's no longer just a tense interaction. Now it's moving toward non-compliance. And this is the moment where things could still go either way. She could comply, step out, keep things calm, and the situation likely de-escalates. But instead, she doubles down. The officer steps back slightly. His tone changes. It's no longer conversational. It's directive. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now." Pause. Silence. You can almost feel the tension building in the air. And then something critical happens. Something that turns a situation from a traffic stop into something much more serious. She puts the car in gear. Now, let's slow this down. From her perspective, she might be thinking, "I'm leaving. I haven't done anything wrong. I know my rights." From the officer's perspective, something completely different is happening. A driver who has been non-compliant is now attempting to leave a lawful stop. That's where the legal line gets crossed. The moment she drives away, it's no longer about a traffic violation. It becomes evasion. Depending on how it unfolds, it can escalate to felony fleeing. And once that threshold is crossed, everything changes. Lights escalate, backup is called, the tone on the radio shifts. What was a routine stop becomes a pursuit. Now think about how fast that transition happens. We're talking seconds. A few decisions stacked on top of each other. And here's the part that's hard for people to accept. None of those individual decisions felt huge in the moment. Refusing to answer questions, asking for documents back, declining to step out. Each one, on its own, might feel justified. But combined, and especially when paired with tone and timing, they create a completely different narrative. During the pursuit, officers are no longer evaluating whether you were speeding. They're evaluating risk, your driving behavior, the environment, traffic, pedestrians. And the charges that follow reflect that shift. Felony evasion, reckless driving, potential endangerment, all because of a situation that started with a belief, "I know my rights." Now let's step back and talk about what actually went wrong here, because this is where people usually misunderstand things. Knowing your rights is not the same as knowing how to apply them in real time. That gap between knowledge and application is where most people get into trouble. For example, yes, you have the right to remain silent, but invoking that right effectively matters. There's a difference between calmly stating, "I prefer not to answer questions," and repeating it in a confrontational tone from the very first second. Yes, you can ask if you're free to leave, but asking it before the officer has completed the basic purpose of the stop doesn't magically end the encounter. Yes, you can record the interaction, but doing so while escalating your tone can make the situation feel more adversarial, even if you're technically within your rights. And yes, you can question an officer's actions, but the roadside is not the place where those disputes get resolved. That's one of the hardest lessons for people to accept. The roadside is not a courtroom. It's not a debate stage. It's a dynamic, high-pressure environment where officers are making rapid assessments based on incomplete information. And your behavior, every small detail of it, feeds into those assessments. Now, let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed openly. Officers expect a certain baseline of cooperation during traffic stops. Not because you're surrendering your rights, but because that baseline helps them quickly determine whether the situation is routine or something more. When that baseline is disrupted, Even for understandable reasons, the stop tends to get longer, more complicated, and more intense. That doesn't mean you should blindly comply with everything. It means you should be strategic. There's a difference between being compliant and being careless with your rights. And there's also a difference between asserting your rights and escalating a situation unnecessarily. Most people don't learn that distinction until it's too late. Another thing that played a role here is emotional momentum. Once the tone of the stop became tense, it stayed tense. Neither side reset it. And in real-world interactions, that matters more than people think. If you start defensive, the officer often becomes more directive. If the officer becomes more directive, you might feel more pressured, and that cycle feeds itself. Breaking that cycle takes awareness in the moment, something that's hard to maintain when adrenaline is kicking in. And then there's the issue of control. A lot of drivers, especially those who believe they know their rights, try to control the interaction early. They try to dictate the terms, set boundaries immediately, and limit what the officer can do. But here's the reality. During a lawful stop, you don't control the structure of the interaction. You control your responses within it. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Trying to control the entire encounter often leads to resistance. Managing your responses tends to keep things contained, and containment is what you want during a traffic stop. Because once a situation expands, once backup arrives, once commands become louder, once movement becomes unpredictable, it's very hard to bring it back down. Let's also talk about passengers, because this is another layer that complicates things. If there were passengers in that vehicle, they're also being observed. Their movements, their reactions, whether they speak, whether they stay quiet, all of it contributes to the officer's assessment. Passengers sometimes make things worse by interjecting, arguing, or trying to help. But from the officer's perspective, that can feel like additional variables to manage. And when multiple variables are in play, officers tend to tighten control over the situation. Which brings us back to that moment, the one where she put the car in gear. That decision didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of everything that happened before it. The tension, the misunderstanding, the belief that leaving was the right move. But in that instant, the situation crossed a line that can't be undone on the roadside. And that's the part people don't always think about when they watch short clips online. They see the moment of conflict. They see the argument. They see the refusal. What they don't see is how quickly the legal consequences escalate once certain actions are taken. Driving away from a stop isn't just ending the interaction. It's creating a new one with much higher stakes. So what should you take from all of this? Not fear, not blind compliance, but awareness. Awareness of timing, awareness of tone, awareness of how your behavior is being interpreted in real time. Because knowing your rights is important, but understanding how those rights interact with real-world police procedures, that's what keeps situations from spiraling. And the next time those lights flash behind you, and that familiar thought pops into your head, I know my rights, you might pause for just a second longer, not to doubt yourself, but to ask a better question. Do I know how to handle this moment without making it worse?